So we're going to do 2 rounds of this. I'm going to show you how to use a thermo instrument, and then Birgit's going to show you how to use a SciEx instrument. And I'm going to try to do, and we're totally doing everything live, so we'll see what happens, actually. It's going to be great. Okay, so I've got us logged into one of the Q-Exactive instruments in the lab over there. And so the idea is I'm going to show you what a method looks like, and then show you how to build one, hopefully from scratch. And we won't try to run it because someone's actually using the instrument right now, but it'll give you an idea as to what the process is like. And then I'll switch over to the Fusion and kind of show you what's different about it. Okay. So, so this is basically just the straight method editor here on the QE. How many of you guys have QEs versus Lumoses? Or Fusions? Okay. And then everyone else has a Fusion or a Lumos? Amazing. All right. You guys are rich. So on this older style method editor, it's not as fancy as the Lumos method editor. There's basically there's a bunch of sections here in which you will acquire data of different types. So what I'm going to do first actually is, if I can, I'm just going to open up a DDA method. So you can see, like, because I assume most of you have done DDA before. Is that true? Anyone not done DDA? Okay. Clearly, I can't double click on things. That's better. My goal here is to not crash the computer while Alex is trying to collect data. So with, while this is loading up, so with when you set up DDA on the instrument, there's like a little button basically that you can drag and drop and say, I'm going to set up a DDA method. And the way it works is it collects a precursor scan and then a bunch of, perfect, and a bunch of MS2s. So it's got this one feature right here. It does a full MS scan and then a bunch of MS2s, right? And so then you set up your MS1 and then you set up your MS2s over here. Can you guys see that roughly, vaguely? It's terrible. But so that's the sort of simple way in which Thermo has made running DDA very easy. So DIA is actually almost as easy. It requires 2 steps instead of 1. So there, with DIA, you end up having to set up your precursor scans and your DIA scans independently. And you set it up basically the same way that you would set up a PRM at the same time. So that one took a lot less time, which is great. And so instead of having one block here where we had this sort of this full MS and then DDA MS2s, we actually have a full MS followed by a DIA block of scans, okay? So we can look at these independently. So if I click on the full MS here, this one on its own, what we do is, and I'm just going to set this up so that we're actually looking at it in advanced mode so we can see all of the parameters here. So this full MS that we've set up here is basically this this sim scan that goes from the entire, it goes from the beginning of the run. So in this case, it goes from 0 time into 130 minutes. So that's basically the entire bulk of the run. This run here is actually a 90-minute linear gradient with a wash and a re-equilibration. The wash and re-equilibration take about 40 minutes on this instrument. So that's where the time comes from. So the way I've got this set up is to run one microscan, one of these, one full MS scan, and set that for 30,000 resolution and an AGC target of 3E6. which is a relatively high AGC target. This is basically the, but in a reasonable range. And then we're having the maximum ion inject time to 55 milliseconds. It's very unlikely that we're ever going to hit this. It should run pretty fast. Like this should usually be in the 1 to 2 millisecond range. So this is just how you would set up a typical DDA sort of method. The only real difference here is that I'm using a 30,000 resolution here. Which relative to how people typically run DDA on an Orbitrap, people might typically do 60,000 or 120,000. Does that kind of like jive with what you guys have done in the past? The reason why is because we really just don't care about the MS1s, right? The MS1s help us learn a little bit of information about where that peak is, but we don't really trust the MS1s to do detection. Whereas MS1's accurate MS1 information is really critical for DDA, where you want to know this is the exact mass that I'm triggering on and I'm not colluding with another peak, basically. Does that sort of make sense? Because that's like literally all the quantitation information you have is only in the MS1 scan. So if I look at the DIA scan here, again, it's going from 0 to 130 minutes. And it's also set at that same resolution, 30,000. The AGC target is 1E6, and again, set for the same 55 milliseconds. So what's going on here is typically when you're running a DDA run, as you would with a QE, you would actually be running the resolution much faster, much lower resolution, much shorter ion inject time. Because there you're maybe less, you care less about the quality of each individual scan, because all you need to do is make a detection from that scan. Here we actually care about making quantitative measurements from those MS2s, so we want to have fairly good accuracy in our MS2s. This is sort of like flipped from how you would typically do DDA, where you care a lot about the MS1 scan, you just want a really fast MS2. Here, we want a fast MS1 because it's just, you know, honestly, it's for helping us understand what's going on with the data more than actually searching or the algorithms are going to use it. And we want good MS2s because we want good quantitative measurements from those scans. So that's basically the sort of normal parameters that you would do. Here I've got this as a loop count of 25. This is a pretty simple DIA run where I'm basically going from 400 to 1,000 in those in 25 increment brackets, right? So 24 MZ wide windows. So if we look at that SIM scan, that first MS scan, one of the things you'll note that unlike with DDA you would typically acquire from 400 to 1600 or something to pick a bunch of precursors to select for fragmentation, here we're only running the scan range from 395 to 105. The intention here is it doesn't matter what's going on above 1005, right? Because anything that's above 1,000 is off our radar in terms of making a detection. So why even bother with anything above that? Does that kind of make sense? So we don't do a full MS survey scan the way you typically would with DDA. Yeah? Okay. Okay, excellent. So we talked about 24, 25 MZ wide windows. So here the isolation window size is 24 MZ. The loop count is 25. That's the amount of scans that we want to collect of DIA before we switch over into an MS1 scan. So the design, the architecture of this is basically collect one MS1 scan, then 25 MS2s sequentially, and then one MS1, and then 25 MS2s. You guys get that? It's pretty simple. And then we set, on the QEs, we typically set a normalized collision energy of 27. That works for us, but whatever works for you and your instrument platform is reasonable. Okay, So that's kind of like the architecture of how the scan system is designed. But one of the things that that you typically need to do with one of these methods is build an inclusion list. So I've just opened up this global list here, and I'm clicking on inclusion list. These are all the scan windows, and these are our center points, not anything else. Okay, so you guys kind of get how that works? I'm just going to create a new document here. So, and we're just going to build one of these from scratch. Okay, and I'm going to show you basically all the steps that I would go through to do that. And the first step that I would do is go to Skyline, actually. And I'm going to go here to Settings, and I'm going to go to Transition Settings, and then I'm going to go build a DIA isolation scheme. You remember how we showed and talked about doing this before? So we're just basically doing that right now. So I'm going to add a new isolation scheme, and I don't actually need to save this necessarily. If I'm not going to be directly analyzing this in Skyline, I don't need to save it down. I just need to have it create the isolation scheme for me. So what I'm going to do here is first run the calculator, and I'm going to go say from 500 to let's keep it the same. So 400 to 1,000, just like that, with 24 MZ wide windows, right? And I'm going to optimize the window placement, and I will set these for overlap so that we can see the structure of what that file looks like, okay? So here I've got all of those set for the centers. And then I'm just going to export that isolation list for the QE. And I'm going to save this on the desktop. And I'm going to open that up in Excel, just so that, again, we can see what that is. Okay, great. So this is our isolation list. You see it counts from, and this is the centers, basically. It counts from 412 as the center all the way up to 1012, and then recounts again starting at 400 as the center, and then all the way to 1,000. So one of the things that you'll note is that there's actually like a little bug here in Skyline, which, Brendan, you should fix at some point. There's this extra window that's created, this 1012 window. 1012 window is going to go from 1,000 to 1,024, right? Do we care about that window? We don't really. So the first thing that I'm going to do is delete that window out. Okay, so that's just a reminder to you to know that Skyline will create a fake window that you really don't actually care about. Okay, so now that we've got this isolation list, the first thing that I'm going to do is go over back to that new method editor, and we're going to set a duration for this of 100 minutes or something like that. Okay, so now we've got 100 minutes time frame for this this method. And then the first thing that I'm going to do is grab a full scan sim and drag it into the doc. So now I've got that set up. So remember the default here is going to go, let's just set this to 100 minutes instead, so it scans the entire thing. The resolution is set up for DDA, right? Like Thermo expects that you're doing DDA for almost everything. So I'm going to change that resolution down to 30,000. I'll keep the same AGC target, but I really definitely don't want it to ever sit and idle for 200 milliseconds. So I'm just going to set that down to 55 milliseconds. The scan range, again, because it's designed for DDA, is going to go from 150, which is really low, to 2,000. That's obviously way outside of our scope, right? So instead of setting this for 400, I'm going to set it for 395. Or actually, I might set that for 385. And the reason why here is that we don't really sacrifice that much, but if there's a big ion that's a little bit outside of our windowing scheme, then again, remember how we were talking about how the orbit trap only holds a certain number of ions? We might overwhelm the orbit trap with an ion that we just don't care about because it's above or below our isolation scheme. So instead of doing like a full MS1 like you typically would, we really do want to just focus on this narrow range. However, you remember how we were talking about the window that's at 400? That window that's centered at 400 is really going to go from 388 to 412, right? And so we want to have the MS1 at least go down to the 388 point. So I set it for 385 here. And I'm going to set on this top end, I'm going to set it for 115 for the same reason. Make sense? Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to do is drag in a DIA method here. Again, I'm going to set it for the full 100 minutes. And for the resolution here, it actually picked a good default, which is 30,000 for this instrument. Now, with DDA, you really gain an advantage for being able to like run the orbit trap really as fast as possible, right? So if the orbit trap like fills its AGC target really quickly, then you can start the scan, and then you can keep going and go on to the next scan, and like maybe that scan is substantially shorter than it would otherwise be. Does that kind of make sense? Like if you don't have to fill for quite so much time, then the overall time is going to be diminished. But one of the things that we really actually kind of benefit from with DIA is that we like to have our scans regularly ordered so that it's much easier to do the mathematics to interpret the data afterwards. So if this space, this timing between each scan cycle is the same, then we don't get like weird compression effects on the beginning or the end of the gradient. I don't know if that makes sense, but one of the things that we benefit from is wanting to keep the scan time consistent from one cycle to the next cycle to the next. So instead of having this relatively low AGC, typically I like to keep this up a bit higher, so like 1E6 instead of the default of 2E5 or whatever it was. Similar to that, the maximum ion eject time, rather than being auto, we do want to have that fixed. We want to set a specific amount of time that it will go for and not be able to go any farther than that. For the loop count, we want to set that for 25 again. And this is the isolation window part, right? So I'm going to want to set that from this like paltry 3 MZ here to 24 MZ. And then for our instrument, we find that this is probably a better collision energy setting, 27. And just to make sure that I haven't missed anything, I'm just going to change that to advanced. Okay, the only thing that, that we would have not noticed is this default charge state of 2, and that's the required, like we need to have some default charge state. And so typically we find that the majority of the ions that we care about with tryptic peptides are +2, so we want to keep that as +2. Okay, so that's basically like the main scan structure that we would set up for DIA. One thing that I typically do in my acquisition is set my collection for both of these to be centroided. And there is some reason to argue that this is not necessarily a good call. I think you can potentially get a little bit more information out of these data files if you set the acquisition to be in profile mode. Potentially the quantitation can be slightly more accurate, particularly if you've got a peak that's actually representative of a shoulder of another peak effectively. However, I find that in practice, those types of files are just really unwieldy to use. And so instead of dealing with like a 4 GB or a 5 GB DIA file, I would rather just deal with a centroided 1 GB DIA file that's already been peak picked by Thermo in the way that I want it to be peak picked, because they do a much better job of peak picking than someone just coming at than you would typically if you were just using like a normal piece of software. They know how to deal with their data better than we know how to deal with their data, for example. Does that kind of make sense? So I typically collect this data in Centroid, but that's definitely a debatable kind of thing to do. Okay? So the only thing that we have to set up now is the inclusion list. So going over to this global list, I'm just going to put in this inclusion list, and that's not what I cared about. This is what I wanted. Okay, this is what's on the instrument. So these are all the windows here. I'm just going to copy those out. And in the mass center section, I'm just going to paste those in. And done. That's it. We've just created a simple DIA method. The thing that you would have to do after this point is set up your LC system to be able to actually inject ions into the mass spectrometer, but that's going to change depending on whatever system you've got and whatever gradient you think is appropriate for your data sets. Okay? Does that seem pretty understandable? Do you guys have questions about setting this up so far? Yes, so settings, transition settings, and honestly, this is the part of Skyline I use the most. It's actually a really cool feature that Brendan set up. Okay, so in isolation scheme here in transition settings, full scan. You go down and you have add, and then you just do this pre-specified isolation windows and calculate it. Cool? Okay. Okay, any other questions on this?
So in case of the PRM, you would basically list the ions here only, or?
Yeah, so you would want to use maybe the PRM setting here, but it's actually very similar. So in the inclusion list, you basically have this, and that's actually kind of an interesting point, is that basically to an instrument, PRM is DIA, and DIA is PRM. Right? They're just regularly scheduled scans. The only difference is that you've got a timing for them. And so you can set that up basically. We could make this a PRM example. Instead of, we would drop down the isolation window to a reasonable level. So like 1.6 MZ wide windows or something like that. So that you get, your target and your +1 monoisotopic or whatever. Your monoisotopic and your +1 peak. There you would paste in your targets instead of the DIA values or centers, and you would have a start scan and an end, or a start time and an end time, and those you would need to specify. Typically with PRM, with SRM, collision energy optimization is a big deal. With PRM, I tend not to optimize the collision energy. and I tend to just let the instrument do it as if it were doing DDA. And so you can set a normalized collision energy on a peptide by peptide basis, but typically I don't. Typically the only thing that I do is change the mass and then put in the Z, so the charge state, and then the timing, so start and stop, right? Like a convenient way to do this is actually to do a file export out of here and build a CSV. Again, I'm just going to stick this on the desktop because I'm a terrible person. So I'm just saving an isolation scheme onto the desktop. And this is, again, a CSV that's text editable. And so instead of trying to type all this stuff into the method editor, I'm just going to work with it in Excel, and then I'll import it back in. It's easy peasy. Cool? OK, any other questions about QEs or how to set them up for this sort of thing? The one thing I haven't shown you how to do is variable with windows, and that's because it's really hard on a QE. It's just not well designed for it. It's much better designed on the swath instruments to be able to set that up. You can do variable with windows. It's just hell to organize the instrument to make it go. OK? OK, so that's, in a nutshell, what a QE looks like. I'm just going to show you quite quickly what a fusion looks like and how it's different, but I won't set up a method. I'll just show you what's different about it. OK, so that's out. OK, so this is the Fusion method editor. You can see it's like a lot fancier, better graphics. You get something for what you pay for, I guess. There is a DIA section here. So this is, but it's basically the same thing. Let me just orient you here. So these are the scan elements over here on the left, just like how we had on the left with the QE method editor. These are the different elements that you can add in, just like how we had above. And here it's going again from 0 to 130. And so again, with DIA here, you really need to set it up as two different blocks. One is an MS1 scan and one is the MS2 scan. Everything in terms of the settings is roughly the same. You will want to do slightly different AGC targets and that sort of thing. But the sort of concept of how you set it up is pretty similar. One thing that you have options to for the scan types is actually to use a DIA setting, but we find that that's actually a little bit kind of contrived in how that's set up, and it's a little bit clumsy to use. And so what we end up using actually are, so this is the MS in the Orbitrap. The second block that I've got here is actually what is called a TSIM, or targeted SIM scan. And this is, again, done in the Orbitrap with HCD. We find that this is a little bit more flexible to set up rather than just using a DIA setting, one of the canned DIA settings that's designed for the instrument. So on the QE, the DIA setting is pretty good. Here, you might as well use a TSIM, which is basically like, remember how we were talking about the difference between whether you're doing PRM and DIA is basically the same. I'm overriding the PRM method to be able to make the PRM settings do DIA, basically. That's it. But conceptually, it's identical, right? We've got the Orbitrap. Here I've got the Orbitrap running slightly faster because on the Fusion Lumos, the source is a little bit brighter, and so we can deal with fewer ions typically, or we can deal with less time to inject ions because we get more overall. And then if I just scroll down here, I've got that same list of MZ targets, right? And they're, again, all set up as charge 2s. And they're going from 0 time to 130 time. So this is basically as if it were looking, as if I were setting up a PRM-y kind of DIA setting. Does that sort of make sense? They're really exchangeable, and you can do one using the other type of setting operations. Okay? Is that good? Any questions about this type of instrument or how it's different? Yeah. Oh, yeah. For the Lumos, the AGC target that I set is actually quite a bit lower because the instrument deals with ion. It's a little bit potentially more. I guess the real reason for the differences of the instrument is we do find that we get effectively the same signal on a slightly different AGC target. AGC is like a made-up number, really. And so the numbers here are actually probably about an order of magnitude lower than we typically would do. And so here I've got it set for 5E4, which would effectively feel like 5E5 on the QE, which is half as many ions as we were looking at before. Remember, we set the Orbitrap to use 1E6 last time. So the reason why I have it at 5E4 is actually because I'm running at twice the speed. My Orbitrap resolution here is at 15,000, and the ion inject time, I think, is only 22 milliseconds. And that's because the Lumos can do better with fewer ions or fewer amount of time, less amount of time collecting ions, because it can collect a larger pool of ions in a shorter amount of time. That's a clumsy way of saying that, but yeah, you can do better with a smaller time and a shorter resolution because you can take an additional set of scans. So here, instead of doing 24 MZ wide windows, I actually am running the thing at 12 MZ wide windows and 50 scans instead of 25 in each duty cycle. Yeah? Okay, so those are some basic settings, but what I want to show you here is I had one of the slides from the last session. I had a link to this page, but specifically to this Quickstart document right here. So this document, you'll sort of recognize some of these slides that were shown earlier. This document is what I was showing you before as having all of those recommended parameter settings for the different instruments as a kind of a starting spot. So that'll give you an idea as to what we would recommend at least starting with in terms of the window widths and that kind of thing. And then it's already got some pre-computed window widths down here. That said, I recommend doing it yourself in Skyline. There's also a tutorial on how you actually do these instrument setups, just like the sort of stuff that we've already gone through today. And that might be a good way to kind of get going. And that link was in my set of slides at least once in that batch of slides. Okay? So with that, I'll hand it over to Birgit so we can talk about how to do this on a SciEx instrument.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you say in your case PRM is very similar to DIA, and that is a little bit different on the SciEx instruments. So there, PRM is actually really similar to DIA. Oh, sorry, too many D's and I's, and SciEx actually used to call DDA IDA, Informative Data Acquisition, but that I found extremely confusing now because now we have DIA, right? So anyway, I stick to DIA and DDA. So on a SciEx instrument, for example, TripleTop 6600 or 5600, PRM is just a fancy type of DDA with an inclusion list where you always run that inclusion list and only that and nothing else. Because that's, you know, what you do, right? You do DDA of peptide 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you start again. So they have the inclusion list and then have a IDA or DDA type method to do that. And I'll show you that, but the swath, that's different, the windows, and I'll show you how they do it also. So yeah, so this is our institute actually, if you're ever in the Bay Area. And so, you know, we talked about the PRM, what we're doing. So we have the precursor ions that we have to fragment. On the website that Ned and Brendan are doing, you can find this paper that we published. It has actually a really good supplement also, which walks you through step by step with the instrument setup. So that's, I recommend that. And so, for example, when, you know, here, this is what I had been doing. So I use DDA acquisition to generate a scheduled PRM mass spec method. So you get, say, 419 peptides. We put them into a Skyline peptide tree. We take one DDA acquisition and then, you know, basically exclude a list of precursor ions from that. And I'll show you in the next slide. And actually, maybe I should switch to the next slide. So we have one acquisition that is our master acquisition that has the retention times that we want. You know, and then we can kind of schedule. So, or actually, you know, actually now with the scheduling, it got so much easier because IRT really, right? So, basically you export a list of your precursor ions that you're interested in. If you want to have it scheduled in Skyline, we can use this retention time scheduling feature to determine. So for example, the blue here is 2 minutes. With blue, the highest number of concurrent or at the same time to be fragmented precursor ions is 40 here. But if I chose, you know, yeah, so and in fact 2 minutes is often something that I think I can still handle with a little bit of variation in the chromatography, but I usually don't go lower than 2 minutes for the instrument acquisition. So in Skyline, for the scheduling width, you can, when you're in the prediction, there's a use measured retention time. So if I have something in my Skyline document that has a measured retention time for the peptides that I want to monitor, you can then define a time window, say 2 minutes. That's the definition of the window. And then you can export a method here, single method, but it uses, then the method type is scheduled. So what that would mean, it means that, you know, the precursor ions here in the Skyline file now will be connected to their retention time. And then there's a template file. And so Skyline can actually export methods to, I think, almost all the different vendors. So what you make is you make like an instrument method that contains most of the important things. You know, like say your voltage and your spray and your gas one and all those kind of things, right? So kind of the template like that. And then Skyline will recognize what the template is, like a DAM method, it knows it's from SciEx, and then add the desired information into that template method. So you'll have to do that on the instrument computer. So you have a Skyline installation on the instrument computer, and then you can basically just export this list of precursor ion masses directly into the acquisition method, the DAM method, and then you can use that and run the instrument. So it's actually quite easy. And so this is how the method would look like in Analyst. This is the SciEx software. So you have like a typical DDA method. So for example, I hope you can see this, the way how they do it. You define, you know, mass spec periods. So you have like a TOF MS1 scan, and then a product ein scan. See, I mentioned they call it IDA, so that's DDA. So this product, this product ein here, there you know instead, so you don't list like all the precursor eins at that point, right? You don't have like 100 things listed here as different scans, but they have an inclusion list tab. And into this inclusion list, Skyline will export the method, the precursor ein numbers in, both the precursor ein MOVs as well as there's a retention time column here. So this will be the retention time that Skyline had for the measured peptide in the Skyline file. So you really export MOV and retention time into this inclusion list. And then here you also define, the template has some number for, the seconds. So actually this is milliseconds here, yeah. But this is the template. I show you how it looks after you've imported this from Skyline into this method. And notice how that will look now. So now this all looks the same, but this is now our list of MOV and retention time. And even though in the template I may have had 60 here, and I had like one CPS here, one count, that is the limit or something. Here, after the import into the template, it recognized that I wanted to have 2 minutes because that's what I had defined, for the retention time window. And so it adjusted that here. So it's 120 now. And now the other thing, this is too much text. Let me just go over to the next thing. So what you have to have then, you have to define an accumulation time, because if all these peptides in your lists now, they have to stay within one cycle, right? So if you have too many things in your list, you have to make your accumulation time low, but then the quality may suffer. And so you want to be right there where you have enough accumulation time quality for the MSMS. Same what Brian said, right? That's the key, right? That's your quantification. You want good MSMS. So for example, in this case, I had like 60 milliseconds. And that would work actually with how many, kind of ions I had in my inclusion list. And then, so you can actually kind of calculate that before, right? So if you want to have 60 millisecond accumulation time for each of the MSMS in the PRM, then the concurrent transitions you will have to know how many you can have there. And then the software will automatically calculate a cycle time for you because it knows how many precursors there are in the inclusion list. And then in this case, it was 3.3 seconds. But then, so SciEx does it so that, basically these inclusion lists in SciEx, usually you set them at a really low threshold and then it will trigger that. And if it cannot find the trigger, it will do something else. But here, you set the trigger to trigger like super high, so it can never really trigger anything, and then it will just go through what is in the inclusion list. So that's some kind of workaround that they had made, which is not maybe that elegant, particularly when you try to explain it. But basically you set the threshold this high that it never would automatically trigger anything from the inclusion list. And if that is true, then it just marches through the inclusion list to do anything. So anyway, that has worked really, really well. It's a little workaround. Again, this is just something you have to set up only one time in this document for the mass-spec method. And then the only other thing you only ever have to do is importing the lists from Skyline directly into this method. And then you can run it. And as I said, then here, this is what I was saying. This is the maximum number of candidate eins to Monaco per cycle, right? 50. So that's like your concurrent transitions shouldn't be over 50 throughout the entire retention time. And then if you have 50 peptides and each with 60 milliseconds, then you have 3 seconds and then maybe 250 for the MS1 scan, and you have a decent cycle time. I wouldn't go over that. You want to look how many peaks over the points over the peak you get. So, and then, when you later put this back into Skyline, then you can just import this through the transition settings forms that we had already looked at in the previous session. And, when you then import your data in Skyline, then this is how it will look. And this is how you set up a PRM method. I'll show you DIA, but I wanted to know how, if that was clear. How it's really easy. It's incredible. It's like really once you just have to install Skyline on the computer of the instrument. Because on all, I don't know if how this is at your place, but on our place we only have the acquisition software installed on the instrument. And because it needs to read in the DAM method, the DAM method, they need to synchronize. But yeah, and then you can just go and maybe one day you import 40 precursors, the next day 50 or more, all depends on the questions for that part. Okay, maybe I'll show you how to do the swath. So swath, right, we get segments and windows, and in the software from SciEx, the analyst software, both on the triple top 5600 and 6600, see now this looks very different from the PRM method, right? So what you have is just one TOF-MS scan, and that I usually set to 250 milliseconds, but one can set it lower, but I would always acquire at least a little bit one, and you said that too, right? So, and then, here, these are your windows. So, you have the slides in the folder, so you can see, I will read this real quick, 400, this was when we still did 25 M over Z windows, right? So we would maybe do 24 windows of 25 M over Z from 400 to 1000. But now we do the variable windows, and I'll show you those afterwards. But here you do 400 to 425, 424 to 450, 449, 475. So you'll always have like the 1 M over Z overlap. And then for the segments, they're like half a M over Z on each side. So this is what you do. You go through each of these scans, doop, 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 and then it starts again at the top. So here there's no funny inclusion list trick that had to be done, right? So they did it this way. And then you basically, what is interesting, see this is like product ein 400 to 425. When you actually here can see this is the product ein scan or MS scan. In a DDA, you usually have to give in a distinct value, but here it's a segment. So, but they say product of 404. So this is located within the window. And the reason why they need a number here is because they need to know what collision energy should they apply. So they apply the collision energy for 404. And then they have a collision energy equation that one can define in some script setting. And we have optimized the collision energy a little bit for swath, and that's on the SciEx website. You can get from there. They have like kind of documents for users and customers. So yeah, each of these windows has, like a distinct mass assigned. This has nothing to do how later you analyze your data, and that will all be automatically filled in. It's just so that they can determine a certain collision energy. And then you just have to define your mass range here for the MS. And here I have a cycle time of 2.25 seconds. But how do we get the windows? And in fact, that we do either, if you want, you can do it through Skyline, like Brian showed you, with the isolation scheme, and just copy that into Excel file, and then I show you how to import that Excel file. So in fact, Christy Hunter and I have written a protocol paper a couple years ago, maybe, when was it? 2017, last year, which is a step-by-step thing, and that's in your folder also, on your web folder. So it really describes every single step you have to set up in the instrument and in the software. And so this is what we will do. So this is like, see, this is your isolation scheme, right? So if I make it in Skyline, and then remember how we had like right, Q1 start, Q1 stop, and then here they have a collision energy spread. That's a SciX parameter that kind of ramps up and down the collision energy a little bit. But this you can get out of Skyline really easily. And it's actually quite interesting. So SciX has developed some of these variable windows as for also as a default for customers. So they have developed one that's 64 variable windows. So that means like in really busy areas of the MS1 space, they have shorter windows and then they get bigger towards the very high M/Z range. So Skyline, Brandon had worked with Christy Hunter. Skyline actually has that as default in the Skyline setting. So if I just open any given file here, if we go to the transition setting, the full scan here, right? So if I were to go to DIA and then the isolation window, what is there as a default on day one when you open Skyline? And you see there's like a swath 25 M/Z, that's the static. But then there's VW64, variable window 64, variable window 100. Those are the SciX windows that they have optimized. And this is how they look with add-in current. So these are the isolation schemes. So all you have to do then is kind of copy this, right? And see also it has the CE range here. And then that can go into be used to build the mass spec method in Analyst. So it's kind of nice how, these programs kind of connect together, Skyline and vendor software. And so once you've generated this Excel file, and again, the protocol paper details this out in detail. Oh, wow, this is really bad to see. Oh, I can't even read it when I stand right in front of it. I'm sorry. Yeah, so then it goes into kind of a template. But it's also not in presenter mode. So where you can either, kind of enter in static windows here, where you say, I want from start mass here to stop mass, and I want the width at, say, a given number, and then it will kind of calculate the cycles for that. But on the other hand, you can do it either that way, but then it's like static windows, or if you just get the like an Excel sheet, then you can just browse and point to the Excel sheet. So that Excel sheet you can either make in out of Skyline, or you can use a tool provided by SciX and also others. There's something called Swath Tuner. So the variable windows, I mean, that's really what it is, right? So where you have, this is basically here a density over a mass range. So where it's like a super busy area where there's a ton of peptides, that's where you make like really small windows. And then where it gets less busy, you make bigger windows. That's the whole concept. And I have found that to be quite well. And, Christy Hunter had done some tests where, she compared a little bit how much she gets with different variable windows. But it's of course a sacrifice, right? If you have more variable windows, the accumulation time is lower. So, I mean, I usually just try this myself a little bit on some tests, and depends also on the sample, right? And how, if you have a concentrated sample, it's probably all good. But I routinely use the 64 variable window method, and that has worked quite well. And then, of course, when you do re-import your DIA data into Skyline, you have to tell it what isolation scheme you were using, right? So you have to remember. That's why, I mean, I'm just happy with the one method. I don't know how much you change your, window setup.
Not so much. I have different methods for phosphoproteomics than I do for normal proteomics. Other than that,
right.
I don't really change that much, but I have tested out a bunch of settings.
Right. Yep. But I think in general the field has gotten to getting a little bit smaller windows, which has, I think, 5, I think, was a little bit high some of the busy areas initially. So you really have a lot less interferences with smaller windows, but yeah.